So, here we're going to be talking about enabling patient advocates to educate patients on interacting with the new generative AI focus in healthcare systems. And I'm sure we've all dealt with denials and approvals, and those are just great. It's so great that we're adding them to everything else now. So, the thing is, AI is already kind of here, kind of, right? It's not actually, you know, in the exam room completely, right? There are places that are attempting to include the uh, the elements here. But the thing is, there are many pieces of where generative AI is in the exam room. It's not necessarily, transcribing the data. That requires usually some form of consent. That usually requires some form of OK, which some people accidentally click, not knowing. Um, on top of that, there could be, auto replies. There could be lots of pieces. If you're working with a patient portal, chances are there is AI in that process, no matter what. So the idea that, we're working in a space that's outside of that is just gone. It's important to note and important for patients to understand that AI is in everything. It's in every single piece of every single component of every single software that they interact with. And what you may not notice is that you're actually interacting with like dozens of pieces of software by the time you actually hit the doctor's office, which is a weird thing to think about. But when you deconstruct every activity, every component, every role, every single one of them has different pieces of software, sometimes synced together, sometimes they're just elements of one larger EHR system, but sometimes they can be a mix of things. Especially if a larger company that is an EHR system does not want to bear the burden of that risk or liability from a new concept, they will simply allow a smaller company to play around. And they'll even give them a little bit of carte blanche to kind of play around with that. They'll give them a pilot to work with. They'll find a partner. They'll do these things just to see how it goes. Again, because they're handing off that liability. And those companies may or may not, have considered a lot of other elements because there are many things that can be a flaw in their system and that still remain this way. Even with all of the pilots that are going on, and most of the things happening right now are pilots, there are a few places that have integrated it in the form of, when you call in and it's redirecting, but that's not really that's really just an evolution of what's been there. For those of us who have had to call into the various health support centers, you've probably noticed that it just went from one automated voice to a different one. Now the one is a little bit more responsive in how it talks to you. Great, cool. And if you yell at it to have a person go, it actually goes a little bit faster sometimes, depending upon the service that you're using. But so the point is that there are a lot of challenges here. The hallucinations can create omissions of vital information. It can produce convincing errors through hallucination. And a hallucination, again, is simply a an output that is functionally undesirable. It is something that is not intended in terms of what you wanted, but if you examine the input may or may not have aligned properly, or there could be a number of different ones. There's something called a faithfulness hallucination and a factuality hallucination. There are a few dozen other ones as well, but the main point is that a hallucination is something that is fundamentally telling you something that is not correct or does not jive with the rest of the thing that's happening. This also, the automation bias that's in here and other biases in the training data can reinforce historical inequities, and it can fundamentally pressure clinicians into trusting an automated answer without meaningful review because, again, automation bias, the idea of, doing something over and over again, and you're just going, oh, well, this is the same thing I've seen before. It's okay. And so it becomes this tricky slope. So these are some of the areas that we're going to kind of focus on right now, just because these are the ones that are really kind of noticeable and ones that we're seeing the pieces in. So when it comes to pharma and trials, you see kind of two spaces. You have one where you have like AlphaFold, which is great, but it has lots of hallucinations that don't understand toxicity, which obviously is going to be challenging given the new NAMs, or NIMS, I think, the idea of having non-animal models, basically having new forms of that preclinical trial component and saying, hey, before clinical trials start, we have to do all these steps. Now you can just do it in silico. You can just do it on a chip. You can do it through these other methods, digital twins, etc. And the challenge with that is that even in the predictions, they don't necessarily scale toxicity well. And the challenge with that scale is once it gets into trials is that often most of that trial data is in fact based off of existing data. And, again, for a white guy like myself, well, that's fine. At the end of the day, I have lots of data and guaranteed lots of data around me. However, for anyone else who is not me, they're likely to experience unfortunate side effects that may or may not have been accounted for because the control is what's being replaced. And so in a lot of these situations, a control is being replaced with these digital models. And so you don't necessarily see that kind of scope. Now, it's also important to note that your controls usually set what you're looking for in your audience as well. And so if your controls only exist of these specific people, and then you extrapolate and say, well, if 90% of our data is based off of these white men, well, surely it can figure out the difference in health between a white man and a man, who might be of a different race in that sense, if you're black, or if you are Indian or Japanese. In all those situations, they have different health outcomes, different situations, and also in that case, if you're a woman. So all those pieces mean that they will extrapolate from that initial data, and of course that won't necessarily create good outcomes in terms of the what it was able to capture in the control. And so it might miss things. And usually that's what clinical trials are for, to be able to find those things. But that's another element that's happening now, where you see the shortening of clinical trials, where now you can skip phase 2 fundamentally. So this creates layers of potential complications. So you might notice that there will be a potential growth in hesitancy in the future when going towards new therapies, because of these effects will become more known. How well known they become, how problematic they become, will really determine based on the risks of the organizations involved, because we are at the beginning right now. We are right now in the situation where we have a phase 3 trial in play for an AI designed drug. And so we will start to see these effects in the future, but it is kind of awkward. But that's really all I'm going to be talking about, the pharma components. We're really going to get into the other pieces here, which are a little bit more relevant for patients specifically. But obviously, if you're going to clinical trials or you need clinical trials, it's good to know this, because it's really tricky already navigating the world of clinical trials, let alone in this new whatever world we're living in. Care management. So ambient scribes are what they're referred to. They're transcription at the end of the day. And in some cases, this can get really awkward, because obviously there's a bridge, nuance, there's a few other ones too. But there's also ones that are a little more complex because they're translation bots. And so they might have a screen that's helping you with transcription and translation, because they don't speak the language, or because you have a physician who speaks a specific language who's helping them out. There could be a number of reasons for this. And those are great. However, again, depending upon the tool they're using. So some of them have been built really well. They've been built well before the generative AI era, and they have decades of that type of translation and transcription, and they work very well. The challenge, though, is that will that persist into the future? It really depends on the contracts and the organizations themselves. So understanding what the actual tech is, if it's new, and if it has AI involved, and asking about if it has generative AI involved in it is a good question to ask, and it's definitely worth asking. The more subtle one, though, is, of course, the ambient scribe. The ambient scribe is supposed to help with soap notes. The whole goal is to help make sure that to reduce the time that the physician is taking afterward to review and write down the notes from their appointment. And personally, I hate this. I think it is an absolutely problematic circumstance, because it's usually a time for reflection, and usually a time for better understanding and trying to connect these pieces together. Thinking about the patient is not the problem. But that being said, this is what's here. And so there are many places jumping on this, and it's certainly the case that you're going to see EHR systems starting to acquire, partner heavily with these tools, if not making their own. Part of this is because if you have this data, is very practical in the sense that you are collecting a lot of information about the patient and physician. The challenge, though, is that most of that data is pretty useless. It's not really helping the goal here. And so let's see here. Oh, my chat button disappeared. There we go. Sorry. Cool. So you're saying that future AI can predict enough to skip phase 2? No, I'm saying that they have a process now to skip phase 2, to skip the whole phase 2 trials. That's a whole thing. It's just out. They're developing a pathway that says, hey, if you produce this data, then we can just skip phase 2 and go right to phase 3. The goal is really commercialization. The question that this FDA has, to be fair, some of these tracks have been in motion for years. But this FDA definitely is more interested in maximizing the amount of commercialization time on the pharmaceutical patent. And so what that means is, shrinking the time ahead of time. The work I do in my day job conveniently looks at the other component of saying, hey, is this, how do we make things faster on the end of actual production and people and things like that? And so it's a little bit weird for us. But when we look at this specifically, we see that here there's a lot of time it takes. It can take years to collect the right patient group, to collect the right pieces. But the other challenge with this too is that if you're obviously you've involved since we're all involved in patient advocacy, a lot of fundamentally patient advocacy groups are fundamentally funded by clinical trials support. So this is they want to reduce the use of laboratory testing and rely more on digital twins. Yeah, it won't happen. The digital twins are not good enough. I'm going to be real. They're not good enough. They can't be. There's just no way. Because they only know what they know, and there's so little known. If we already think about how much we don't know about the human body, well, that's the same thing for the digital twin. The digital twin is arguably worse. And remember, it does not know the differences between, genders, races, everything else, the slight nuances, even of genetic circumstances. So the N of 1 problem actually is magnified by digital twins in an unusual way, which is actually why they're trying to use it in that circumstance. We see that with ultra rare diseases, and why the plausible mechanism pathway is such a specific point of contention, because they want to use it, but it's also the biggest risk that we've seen provided by the FDA in terms of a channel in a long time. It is really an expansion specifically for genetic conditions of expanded access or compassionate use. Okay, back to ambient scribes. So the thing about ambient scribes, though, is that critical omissions are huge, where it can just drop or misunderstand. This comes even further when it comes to anybody sporting an accent other than this. The tools fundamentally understand a lot of the language there, but there are actually a few accents they do somewhat well with, again, because of where the voice training happened. It also depends on the tool. If it's like Dragon, it has a lot bigger pool to work with, and it tends to do a little bit better. But certain accents it does struggle with, and newer words also become a difficult way. If somebody also has a weird way of saying a word that's unusual, that can also come into play. So there are lots of elements here. Also, if somebody says something quickly, the word can and the word can't are very, very close together in terms of how they can be interpreted. And one has a very different meaning than the other. And so that is a challenge that needs to be corrected. So notes need to have appropriate review if the ambient scribe is there, which kind of defeats the point of the scribe itself. And so that's why I'm like, I don't see necessarily the benefit of the reduction in documentation time, because the doctor still has to review those notes. And often thinking about it can be a better form of review anyway, because if you think about how cognitive offloading works, like when you're using a calculator, same thing. So here, just like using a calculator reduces your ability to quickly draw those mathematical components, same thing with patients. If you do not have that time to review, write down, and put those pieces in, you will simply remember less about your patient. And maybe that makes you, less responsive in certain circumstances. So I'm sure we'll see this as time goes on. It really depends on what's best for the hospital system, and so they will make those decisions. But it's important to note, just because, again, you'll have to be more diligent about watching your notes. As a patient, that's what that means. It means reviewing your clinical notes after every single appointment, because there's no way that a transcription tool jotted it down properly. It's just highly unlikely that it jotted it down properly, especially if it's generative AI based. Okay. Diagnostics. So, Google AMI, there's a bunch of different tools that are really good at differential diagnosis. And the thing is, they are very good. We're talking about, a very, very low error and hallucination rate that is comparable to a person in some cases. And so these tools for diagnostics and decision support are genuinely going to be one of those things that I definitely see kind of coming into play, like hardcore. The other one's less so. This one, though, because, you think about triage and you think about the way triage works. If you can work triage into diagnostic support from a conversation, that's huge. I've already seen multiple healthcare tools, including an organization nearby me named Hogue, where they actually have a conversational triage bot that you talk to, like, all the time to tell it your health problems, which I think is concerning. But there, they think it's great because they're collecting all this patient data about their health. They might find that they're going to collect additional information about other patients and other things, and how to disambiguate that is going to be difficult. But that's what checking the notes are for. That's what checking all these pieces. But the question becomes, is with these conversational tools, where do those notes go? It's always a good question to say, hey, where does this go? Where does this data get collected? How does this data get attributed? It'd be good questions to ask regarding those pieces. Um, Next one here is devices and wearables. Now, this is a public health one, personally, because to be honest, wearables are kind of bad. I wear one, but I've mentioned before, I have multiple devices because I have medical anxiety as a result of, lots of just years of dying of end-stage liver disease and then coming back to life from a transplant. And so for me, I have lots of different devices to scan and check my pulse, uh, blood oximeter, all the basics, blood pressure, things like that. And so I will consistently do them all in a round and note that they all have different levels. And sometimes they need to be recalibrated. There are so many different components that tell us that one individual, is not necessarily a useful thing for the wearable. So when clinical trials are paired with that, which is a thing that's common, that's going to be common when it comes to decentralized clinical trials, it will be a thing that will happen at some point. Um, Unless those tools are provided for you and they're calibrated, it's going to be unlikely that it's going to be very accurate or helpful. Uh, if they are using like a standard on an Apple Watch or something else like, and they push an update to it, that might be a workaround for it. So just note those are the pieces that could come into play with wearables. But for the most part, wearables are really good on scale. So even though their data is wrong, it's going to sound weird, it's wrong consistently. And so because it's wrong consistently, it can tell us a trend. So this has been really useful for smart thermometers. Back when we had the COVID pandemic was kicking off, there was a big issue regarding these smart thermometers because people were like, oh, they can predict when COVID is going to be in an area or when flu is going to happen. In a way, yeah, because people at home are testing more often, and that's telling you that, oh, we're seeing higher average temperatures from people here. We're seeing a higher average this from people here. And they're doing that before they go into the ER, before they go into a medical system. And as we know, when it comes to county health data is obviously as soon as they collect it and as soon as it's been attributed. And that could take a few days. That could take a day. That could take a day or two, depending upon the dashboard, depending upon the system, depending upon whatever other architectures involved. And so wearables on a larger scale from a public health perspective do give us trends and indications, which I imagine for when monitoring for respiratory illnesses that are common or are moving, that can be somewhat helpful. That being said, if tests are accurate as well. If a Sensi spec on a test is poor, then the data on scale might also still not be as helpful. But again, big numbers, as long as you have a ton of them, you could indicate a trend. So if you see a change in that, we're like, oh, well, there's more positive cases here than not. That could be a case of more false positives, but it's likely a case of more things happening. So the benefit here is that these tools are producing these elements. The downside is obviously here, noisy sensor data is a problem for clinical oversight. Going back to diagnostics, it can fabricate ambiguous patient speech. It can fabricate other elements that are there. So that can happen. So there are these pieces that are obviously the fault of normal generative AI systems that can continue on from other pieces. Let's talk about faves. So in 2024, they decided to do something. They were like, so I guess AI is going to be used in all these healthcare systems. We should probably provide some guidance on this. And so this is actually FAVES actually comes from HHS and the ONC healthcare rule, HDI 1, basically health tech information rule 1. And for certification for any hospital that employs any sort of technology, they have to be certified by this process. And so FAVES right now is the current standard, although the Trump administration has introduced a new rule in December. It is a proposed rule right now. We'll see where it goes from now. It will probably be adopted in some part, in some way. Importantly, it doesn't necessarily eliminate FAVES, but it does change a lot of the architecture of how a hospital holds those records. In some ways, ironically, it actually empowers it because it moves the requirement of the model card and transparency elements from the company to the hospital. Obviously, that's a larger expense, and so that will have downstream effects as well. But the main point is that FAVES is fundamentally the basis for what I have what I'll be presenting over the next a few minutes, and which is what I like to call, just a AI-focused patient bill of rights. This is not actually a legal standard in the sense that this is actually verifiable in that way. It is guided by the very principles that are in FAVES themselves and and how those work. Essentially, though, each of these rules is based off of other legal components. So, fairness, there are pieces within ADA that deal with that, and so each one of them does have its origin not simply within the rule itself, but in other laws and court precedent. So the change from the new rule will not alter those because the basis of them is not being altered, if that makes sense. So we'll go into FAVES. So FAIR does not disadvantage people based on demographics, geography, or insurance status. There's a number of other pieces as well. And FAIR here is actually a really important component because it goes back to that training data point I mentioned before. So the question is the model capable of doing that piece there? A, appropriate, validated for specific patient population, intended care setting, valid performance limitations set by, supported by reliable external testing, effective, produces a meaningful patient benefit, not simply an increased volume or hospital revenue. The idea that it is actually useful to you as a patient, which is cool. It's like the first time I've seen that, so I'm super stoked about it. Safe, no known risks are controlled, errors are detectable, and importantly, humans remain accountable. That is a very critical piece, very critical piece. And apparently there we go. My camera has decided that I did the right command and it now moved weird. Sorry about this. Cool. Camera go up. There we go. I apparently put it to sleep. Good to know. Technology. All right. So this is kind of what I've assembled here based on what we've seen in terms of FAVES and in terms of other state laws. So here is really the first one, the right to know when AI is involved. This really includes when the AI is used to record or summarize a medical visit, draft a clinical note or patient message, interpret an image, laboratory result, or monitoring signal. That, again, is still in its infancy, and I suspect will probably not be that used in the sense of the outcome, just because it's so expensive. Medical images have to remain uncompressed, which is difficult for a tool to not alter when it uses as a reference. And so that becomes a very difficult thing. It can be laid over and it can help indicate things. It can help find, but largely speaking, it will likely not be used as I think a lot of organizations want it to be used, simply because it's just so expensive to run. Recommend a diagnosis or treatment option, prioritize patients for outreach or follow-up, review prior authorization or insurance claims, flag prescriptions or recommend medication substitutions, generate discharge instructions and educational materials, power a chatbot, voice assistant, or virtual healthcare representative. So now in some places, notice is required. It's supposed to be given in plain language and before the AI interaction whenever practical. So a small disclaimer is often hidden in a privacy policy, but it's not really a meaningful notice. It has to be an independent notice. And so a lot of them, they will put a checkbox when you sign in. And a lot of people won't even really read that because it's this long thing. And that is one way they get around it. It's very simple. Another way can be, asking, one thing there. Now, what patients can say is, was artificial used to create, review, prioritize, or influence this information? Simple questions. And you also have copies of all of this information as well. Could you please explain what the system did and what a qualified person reviewed? Am I communicating with a person, an AI system, or a combination of both? It is important to note that a lot of people are actually a combination of these things now. When you are using software, you tend to be using some form of AI. Now, it's important to also know what you're getting in return, right? So you should be getting the general purpose of the system, whether an AI system generated, summarized, recommended, ranked, or decided something, what information it used, which qualified person reviewed the output, and how a patient can request a human alternative. Cool. So now, important that this touches a few things. Here we have patients cannot evaluate. So in this case, appropriate and safe. So this is hitting two of them. This is patients cannot evaluate whether an AI system is appropriate or safely supervised when they do not know it's being used. Very simple. The right to meaningful human review. So here, patients should have access to a qualified human who can independently review AI-influenced clinical, insurance, pharmacy, or administrative action. Human review must be more than clicking approve. The reviewer should have enough time, authority, information, and relevant expertise to question and overturn the automated output. Now, this is important when AI is used to contribute to triage or urgency of urgent decisions. Diagnosis or treatment recommendations, hospital discharge planning, medication safety alerts, prescription delays, insurance denials, prior authorization determinations, termination of services, change in eligibility of benefits, and medical necessity reviews. And as a patient, I can say I'm requesting an independent review by a qualified person who can reconsider and change this decision. Who personally reviewed my individual circumstances rather than relying on automated response? Please do not treat this AI output as the final decision. These are all general statements. They can obviously be altered a little bit for the needs there. Insurance decisions, have different pieces, but importantly, this touches on three letters again: valid, effective, and safe. Even a statistical accurate system can be wrong for an individual patient. So human review creates a necessary opportunity to detect errors, consider context, and prevent avoidable harm. The right to fair and non-discriminatory treatment. So patients should be protected but from AI systems that produce or amplify historical inequities. An algorithm can appear neutral, while relying on data that reflects unequal access to coverage. For instance, prior healthcare spending, continuous insurance coverage, missed appointments, zip code, or incomplete medical records may indirectly reflect income, race, disability status, rural access, transportation barriers, or other structural factors. This is actually occurring right now. There's a large lawsuit that is going to court from Workday, which is involving applications for jobs, wherein they were using graduation date as a proxy for age, and that resulted in fundamental age discrimination by algorithm. And so we are seeing these new types of statutory pieces coming into play in different areas that will have influence here because AI is delivering the same type of fundamentalisms. Now, as a patient, you can always ask, you can ask if these results could have affected the result. And it seems odd, right? Because the people we're asking probably won't have the answer to this question. But we are in a weird moment. And so when I talk about these rights, I also want to point at this moment here. We are essentially working in a space where all of these, I'm calling them, sure, all of these kind of, maybe not rogue per se, but these very intentional actors who are smaller companies, middle-sized companies, who are startups often, who are coming into the space, who are not familiar with the complexity of the space that they're entering in. And often, even if they are familiar with it, they may not be familiar with the limitations of their system for one reason or another. Often folks in tech are willing to kind of look beyond that for the sake of the goal. In my experience working in the startup culture, that is a common experience. So the questions of could insurance history, location, disability, language have affected this result? What steps were taken to make sure the system does not disadvantage underserved patients? These questions are fundamentally also arming the people who work there because they don't necessarily know that these problems persist and exist. And the thing is, having people in the actual organizations hear these things repeatedly, understand these things repeatedly, does have an impact. I do think about what happened here, a large data leak that happened here in San Diego a few years ago with one of our larger healthcare systems. And they issued a notice and people were furious and continued to mail and continued to talk and continued to complain. And it did have an impact. They did change a lot of their transparency pieces. They put out a lot more information on what happened and they tried to, amend the result. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with people can still respond. And so it's important that we are in this. Remember, this time is a time where the disruption narrative basically means that it is a very malleable place. And so a company is less willing to adopt things it thinks that its pieces, including its employees and its fundamental customers, are not cool with, who are actively, questioning and adding these other pieces to it. And sometimes these questions are good questions because they are asking that like I said, this larger legal component that they are aware of that they have to comply with. And so these creates these threads that while some places will have boilerplates, some places will have answers, some places will understand their architecture, and some places will not. As I'm sure you've dealt with hospitals, some hospitals, while EHR is the standard, some hospitals still have a lot of paper. Some hospitals still have a lot of pieces that are a little bit older, and so it's not surprising to see that. So importantly, patients should ask about performance across relevant groups, which obviously includes race and ethnicity, age, sex and gender, disability status, primary language, rural or urban location, insurance status, socioeconomic conditions, skin tone or body type, when relevant to a device. Because yeah, if you have a different skin tone, turns out these things with the lasers and stuff don't work out that well. There's a very excellent there are some excellent influencers who talk about the specific things about skin tone and wearables and why those things get really tricky. People with multiple or uncommon health conditions. Yeah, if you have a rare disease, ultra rare disease, or if you have multiple comorbidities, yeah, you're going to have a tricky time when it comes to how this data all interacts. So number four, the right to an appropriate tool. Turns out this is actually a component in there too. It's a matter of saying, why is this AI tool, appropriate for a specific patient like me? It should be an AI system should only be used for its purpose, population, and setting for which it has been properly evaluated. There's no panacea. Just like there's no panacea in the real world, there's no panacea on a piece of software. It's the same way. Every generative AI tool has to be incredibly prescriptive, incredibly so. Uh, Yes, they generally don't have much. So in some cases, when you're talking with clinicians, they're going to be relatively limited. But the idea is that giving them the appropriate language is where it starts. And since most of them won't have necessary training delivered by their organizations or their larger systems, being involved personally with, with some entities with ASLD, there we're trying to deliver some of these pieces there. We're saying, hey, look, this is the language you use to help understand what's underneath it. Some clinicians some clinicians may not. It really depends on how involved they are. Um, but largely speaking, these questions are going to end up going to um, some call center, reasonably speaking. Whether that call center is for a provider group, whether that call center is for an insurance company, whether that call center is for a pharmacy. Most of these places will end up going into those kind of call center farms. And those places there do have, an ultimate authority that they are speaking to. So most of these questions, though, can go to clinical providers, but they are unlikely to have any control over the tools that are required to use, especially if they are in a system that is whole house, right? So I think about like Kaiser, where they are the insurance company, they are also the hospital group, and they have all these pieces in between. And so when Kaiser says we want to use this, then usually there's a pathway that says we're going to use this. Um, and so that can be tricky. The challenge here is that the only way for this system to fundamentally change is either for the insurance company to see it as too big of a risk, or for the healthcare group to see it as too big of a burden. And so the question then becomes, how does review happen in a meaningful way to make sure that they are doing all the appropriate steps and following through these? And so all these is fundamentally saying, we're requesting transparency. We want to see transparency. How do we see that transparency? And so a lot of these questions end up laying seeds within clinicians, within groups, to start kind of that process. The only way to make these meaningful changes, generally speaking, is to have champions within organizations who are willing to spearhead that. Is a clinician willing to do that? It may or may not be the case. They may not have time. As we know, they have how many minutes per patient sometimes. So it can be very tricky in that sense. There can be nurses or nurse practitioners or other groups who might have a bit more inclination to be able to champion that. And at the end of the day, some of these questions, the more that they're used, the more that they're wielded, we are likely to see better results in terms of this knowledge here. It is about arming folks with the knowledge to understand what is happening, because we're dealing with fundamentally what's happening is an information asymmetry problem, where you have a bunch of companies who know a lot about what they're doing or claim to, and are instituting these new systems that there is a certain amount of trust being provided from the organization on that behalf and saying we're instituting this system. But we don't really know a lot of these underlying architectures, because I don't know about you, but I don't know a lot of doctors who have lot of basis in AI themselves. I know a few only because of the work that I do, but outside of that, no, because why would they? They are already busy as it is. Um, so here are some warning signs for appropriate tools. A general chatbot for high stakes clinical tasks. This can happen with shadow AI, where someone actually takes it, talks, and uses that PHI or PI on like a chat GPT, like a public tool. That is something that's even trickier than anything else because there's no way for you to know that. And unless they say it, in which case that is a obvious HIPAA violation, and really tricky. That one, trying to solve that is your basic HIPAA violation. So you just go through the normal channels with that. But cannot clearly describe the system's intended use, applying a tool to a new population without additional evaluation, and expands a pilot system into broader use without renewed testing, using wellness technology to make clinical insurance determinations. So again, this is becoming a piece. We are in the midst of this transition. So again, this deals with the appropriate status of faves. The A is that it's an appropriate tool for it. 5 here is the right to evidence that the system is valid, right? So this is really about, validity should not be based on marketing claims, impressive demonstrations, or the fact that the output sounds professional. Patients do not need proprietary source code, but they should be given enough information to understand the evidence supporting the tool. So, you can ask the questions of how was the system validated before it was introduced into patient care? What evidence supports using this model? It sounds weird for us to have to ask these questions. But what we are doing is, as I mentioned before, we are providing the specific concern to each of the providers, to each of the pieces, so that this way it does create the seeds for what's here. It's unfortunate in terms of, our options for this, but we are in a very controlled system, and so we are activating within it. So insurance company, what evidence support using this model for this type of coverage review? Pharmacy, is this alert based on my complete medical profile or a generalized automated rule? Medical device or wearable, how does the system respond to any missing, noising, or inaccurate sensor data? Valid, a system should be shown to perform as intended to appropriate testing, including the external evaluation after deployment. So the other 5 right here. And so here we go to the right to care that is effective for patients, not merely efficient. And this is the E after all. So here we look at healthcare AI should be judged by whether it improves patient understanding, access, safety, and experience or health outcomes. An AI scheduling agent might answer calls quickly, but it still fails patients if it misclassifies urgent symptoms. An automated insurance process may issue decisions rapidly, but still be ineffective if patients experience inappropriate delays or must navigate repeated appeals. An ambient scribe may reduce documentation, but still fails if it omits important details from the record. And so a patient can obviously ask, how does this improve care? What are patient-centered outcomes being measured? How can patient complaints, delays, corrections, and appeals be included in your evaluation? Patient-centered measures may include fewer harmful delays, more accurate records, better patient comprehension. So the thing is, these are things that it should be accomplishing. These are some of the KPIs that the tool should allow for. Reduced administrative burden or patients, more equitable access, fewer medical errors, etc. And so again, this has the faves connection of being the E in faves. The proper measure of success is meaningful patient benefit, not the volume of generated AI messages, notes, claims, or recommendations. The right to safety, error correction, and incident reporting. So here, this is probably one of the biggest area, to be honest, is the thing is, like I said before, as a patient now, when I come back from my thing, I have to check my notes immediately and make sure to issue corrections immediately, because I know there are going to be mistakes. There always have been in the past, but now with transcription, they become amplified further. So generative AI can produce information that is fluent and persuasive but false. It can fabricate a detail, omit an important system, confuse an old diagnosis with a current condition, attribute a statement to a wrong person, or create a citation that does not support the claim. So a patient can say, I believe this is AI generated or automated information that contains errors. They can also just say, correct this and just have the direct words. I know I have submitted countless times just saying, hey, change this to that. And it's usually a positive to a negative. So it's a can or a can't or these other pieces. Because in my case, when I was on disability, I was very concerned about what those notes said. Because if I was in a situation where, those notes got just stayed in there too long, it could affect my status and could affect my overall health outcome and probably my health outcome as being alive. So important things. Examples requiring correction: a visit note where a patient is denied a symptom that was actually reported. The system documents consent that was never requested. A medication list that contains a discontinued prescription. A chatbot supplies a fabricated policy. A pharmacy system incorrectly identifies. Yes, it cannot erase the error. That is correct. It just adds to it. So it adds that the patient added these corrections. It is awkward. I have to say there needs to be a better solution to that. But yes, it is all additive, and that's, I think, because of the tamper-proof way that notes are recorded to begin with. So yeah, it's not technically a correction. It's just a note that says correction. That's been my experience, and I'm sure that's the same with everybody else. Um, Number 8 here is data control. So patients should not be pressured to disclose more information than necessary. Consent for care does not automatically become consent for unrelated product development, advertising, model training, or sale of data. One of the difficulties that I've come across is that a lot of patients, a lot of patient advocates that I work with who are just kind of more general, where they've encountered their system and they go, how is this being used? And most of the time, I've kind of told them it's not really being actively used right now. It's not actually a decision in the care process. It's being used in training data to help train the tool to be better at what it's doing. Most pilots, most systems right now are actually being used to train data, to train systems, to make them more efficient. And the question is that useful to you? Do you want that? Do you want to be included in that? And does that actually protect your data? Is the training data protected? If they use a federated model, it's likely that it will do a better job of that. Federated learning model means it's actually separated and segregated. There's a whole piece to it. But just note that a federated learning model is the better way for that type of security to ensure how it works. So here, this especially is important for audio recordings of clinical visits, genetic information. Really, this is the same type of controlling that PHI that we really care about a lot anyway. And this, of course, is about appropriate and safe, but this is also fundamentally your HIPAA data in a way. When it's when it's used in the training data, it could be stacked. It could be used in a number of fashions. It can also be accessible. Training data is not immutable. It can be accessed. It can be accessed by anyone who has access to that system. Number 9, the right to an understandable explanation. Things have to be explainable. You have to be able to know what it is. You can say, please explain this in plain language, what information from my record was used, what facts mattered most. There are lots of important ways to go about this, but you should definitely be aware of citations that don't exist when you see these things. Again, getting the copy of relevant records is helpful, but obviously now that we have our patient portals, we can see a lot more, but we're not actually seeing the whole bit of data. Like I said before, when it comes to those communications, we don't know what's being used of those, and sometimes those questions can help lay those seeds. The last one is obviously, the right to appeal. In this case here, it's a matter of saying, I need a human alternative. I want to know, that I can talk to a person about this. And usually you can. Usually, when you call in to either insurance or call into a medical billing or some other place where you're trying to have these kind of corrections put into play, you can get eventually to a person. It is unfortunate sometimes how long it takes. It can take an hour or two sometimes. Sometimes it's a callback number. And it can be trickier depending upon the system, depending upon how impacted that system may be. Yeah. Yep. There are so many stacks of data. Sometimes some clinicians can access them, sometimes other pieces can too. It is so cool and also terrifying just how much data they're collecting. They will not provide training visibility into the training set. They won't. The only real solution to that is honestly going to be policy change from the state and federal level, and I don't know when that's going to happen. There The only level of visibility that we see is the model card, which gives us an idea about what training data it's accessed, but it does not tell us the specifics of that training data. What you can say is you can ask them, was my data going to be used in training? They can know that. And so you can say, I do not want my data to be used in training, and that's kind of a way to control that. But other than that, you won't be able to request that for a scale of reasons, mostly in the sense that it's also a whole bunch of conglomerated patient data. Sometimes de-anonymized, probably. Sometimes probably not, because fundamentally with generative AI, anything that can be de-anonymized usually can be re-anonymized, or come back to come back to who it is. Um, so this can be a very tricky piece here. Um, I also want to point out here in this next slide, I left these in here because I use generative AI often to produce my slides. So I have a whole all my research, all my pieces, and then I will take those pieces and put them into other generative AI tools. I have a few. Recently, I've been using Notebook because it's produced some things pretty well, but I want to showcase this next two slides because they are these last two slides, but what happened when the generative AI did it. Is there something noticeably wrong with what you're seeing here? The rights don't make numerical sense. Goes 1, 2, 7, 9, 10. And then the next one gives it 3, 5, 6, 8. And technically it has all 10. They're not in a similar order, but here it's assigned them. It's just arbitrarily grouped them based on these elements that it believes these pillars are. And so this is kind of a thing that sometimes generative AI will do without that specific piece. So earlier I mentioned talking to generative AI is kind of like talking to a genie. You have to be incredibly specific with what your prompt is and how you're working with it. And oftentimes when doing these larger prompt chains, because it's actually building sections of the presentation. And so here what it's doing is that it can't do math well. This specific generative AI does not do math well. And so it also can't count and is unaware of how time works. The time, space, relative positions are not there. And so these elements kind of they are a component of the majority of generative AI use in tools in most of healthcare. So they do not understand what time takes, which means that if your notes include something that has some sort of, time frequency or things of that nature, those are nebulous concepts to the tool. And even if they've been ground truth, which means they've been set in stone and said, this is the way it should be, always refer to this when these elements come into play, that doesn't necessarily guarantee it understands it because it has no understanding of time. It has no understanding right now of space and contextual relationships in three-dimensional space as we move about them. It can understand relative position in terms of context, like what something is next to in a still image. But when it comes to a larger video, that can be very difficult. And so this is how we see that presented here. And so it's just a good note that these tools are not nearly as effective in that way. And so that can have ripple effects on all of the other notes and things it's taken. So here we can talk about automation bias. Automation bias is that idea, right? The idea that, is that cognitive offloading, is that piece that goes, well, I trust it. It's doing the thing. I've seen this before. That looks good. Okay, cool. Check the box. So if they're taking only 2 seconds to review the claim, that's not great. It has to be line by line. It has to be, you have to have an actual clinician look it over. And I know this is even hard before AI, back when you had peer review where it's supposed to be a peer. And maybe maybe the term peer is very loose in that definition. Again, it's good to note here. Here we see again, and just a nice kind of chart about where AI is being operated at every stage of care. It's actually more complex than this. There's even more. So when we talk about the visit, there's way more than that. Obviously, there's the imaging components. There's all the other pieces. The research phase has even more layers within it too, because it's also the manufacturing. It's also the clinical trials. Lots of pieces in there. Post care, includes everything from the chatbots and remote monitoring to also follow up and collection there. Surveys now come into play as well. Surveys also come into play in the sense that they're going to be attributed in some way meaningfully. Obviously, it's de-anonymized, so it's separate. So it's separate from you in that way. But the question will become, how will that end up having influence in this system as well. Billing is I think, probably the worst part of this, at least from conversations, in terms of insurance denials, insurance pre-approval, those pieces of there, as well as what happens when someone puts the wrong code in. What happens when an automated system decided that this code should be in instead of this other code? I've definitely seen lots of instances of that type of thing happening. And sometimes it just keeps happening. And even when you correct it, you can come back again the next month and do it again. I've known people who have been doing this for 9 months now because the system moved over to some other system that may have included AI, and it's difficult to disambiguate where that is in that process. And so, I keep tabs on them to see what their successful interactions are, so that this way we can actually see if there are good tactics to avoid that, because that is obviously a big hurdle. So again, yes, the probabilistic math here. So if there are contextual missing pieces, hallucination comes into play pretty easily. And so that's how you get the fabrication. So if there are pieces of that contextual component, that's why I say it's like a genie, in the sense that, you have to give it all the information. And sometimes you don't always know what all the information that is needed to give. And obviously you can have context erasure. Um, let's see here. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, some patients don't even know when or if they have coinsurance, or how coinsurance works. There are scales of lack of understanding how a code works through a system, let alone talking with those people. I have attempted to try to find out how someone is responsible, or who is responsible ultimately for some codes in hospital groups, and been unable to find out who. And I've worked for months trying to, pull that out. So again, ambient scribes, the idea is the third-party AI server. Yeah, they're coming in there. Sure, it can be HIPAA certified server. That's great. But here's the thing. At least in California, at least in Florida, at least in a handful of other states, we have two-party consent. And so there we can at least say, hey, you have to have two-party consent to do this, and I'm not giving consent. You can even start off your conversation with, I am revoking or denying any consent to be recorded. And that's how that chatbot will start that recording off. And the question is that recording actually then triggering it to deny it or something else? Litigation will end up kind of resolving that in the future, unfortunately. There are current cases right now where generative AI systems are auto-populating in notes asserting certain consent was given. And now we're going to see how that comes into play. That court case is still ongoing. There are a handful of court cases that are looking at these factors. I have included a handful of very short workshops, public AI programs that patients can safely use. Whew. Whew. Public is the key word there. Um, I have not encountered many publicly accessible ones, if only because there's such a cost running the generative AI model underneath that it can be tricky. Some patients make them and make good ones. Like a colleague of mine made a really nice one for looking at pharmaceuticals and making sure that you're paying, the appropriate amount for them, or how to solve and resolve those pieces. The challenge is that, is she aware of all the security requirements regarding that patient data? Yes. Did she take them into account when creating the software? Maybe. She's not a coding expert, so she's vibe coded the site. It's very useful. And thankfully, the way she's done it, doesn't have the same level of, PHI components, so it's not as vulnerable. But other places don't do that so much. So the challenge is that there are a lot of AI programs that are publicly available that, will suck up that data, and their whole purpose is selling the data. The general idea is, I think we've all heard if it's not free, you're the product. And fundamentally, that does apply to a large portion of these tools, especially with patient data, because it is worth noting that in the past, as much as 1/8 of Google searches were specifically healthcare oriented or wellness oriented. And so that is a significant market. It makes sense, because if we look at the overall economy, that reflects that same amount. So it's kind of pretty consistent. But what that means is that there's a lot of money in that data. And so, the question is are those available? There are some entities I found that are really good, but usually the other challenge is that they have to be hyper specific. So the reason why, like, I trust one of the generative AI tools regarding liver health is because I helped advise on it. And so they asked me for my advice on how these things would go as a patient as well as a generative AI patient advocate. And so I'm going like, hey, these are how these pieces work. And so for me, I trust that one. And they make it semi-available to the public. And they're honestly they're a health food bar. They're Calamity. And so for them, they do liver health, but they've also worked with a bunch of clinicians to make sure that it has accurate information that's available. Can it still hallucinate? Yes. Can it still do these things? Certainly. Have they done a lot of work to make sure it minimizes those pieces? Yes. Have they tried to work around these problems? Totally. So there are ones that are there. Some of them are provided by the healthcare providers themselves. I am leery about those because I don't know what information is being collected in that's being used for training data, that's being used for, um, you know, just general attribution, or the worst case scenario is that that information is somehow accessible from the insurance provider itself. And why I say that's the worst case scenario is because if an insurance provider has access to the conversation that's occurring between the individual and the healthcare provider before they even step into the office, it means that they could have denials ready right from the get-go. Like the idea of prior authorization becomes even more awkward when they have functionally a prior denial. Now, I'm not saying that they do this. I'm just saying that the capability is there with this information. And it is in the incentive, it is in the interest of of a private insurance company to earn a profit. And so therefore it is the economic interest of the institution to search for ways to do this, and to deny care is fundamentally to make a profit. So that being said, do I see it happening? Possibly. And I see that this is the avenue for it. So that is my one kind of caveat around the using the healthcare systems for that purpose. The benefit though is that it could actually give you helpful information. Genuinely, when you're really seeking it in that non-emergency setting, or you have a semi-emergency where you need to better understand where to go or what to do, totally. Um, I don't, again, asking them for the information about the model card, seeing what actually is under the hood, and then asking them for an understanding as to saying like, well, who reviewed this medical information for accuracy? How did this thing go? And so those are questions I might ask to the provider. But again, if you can ask them, and sometimes you can ask the tool, sometimes the tool will tell you. Awkwardly enough, either via prompt injection or directly just asking the tool. Sometimes the tools are even provided to answer those questions directly. Um, Challenge with generative AI, though, um, while generative AI parrots us, it's more like a game of telephone. It's not actually copying things. Most of them are really good at identifying and finding, but going beyond that can become very difficult. So, here are a handful of specific kind of scenarios. These are kind of just designed to do some little role play exercises to better understand how that kind of articulation can work. Obviously, these are really just kind of general ones that can be kind of modified for the need, but they're really about kind of explaining the uh, what's being collected, how it's being collected, and why you want to understand that vulnerability and how, as a patient, I should be, moving forward with it. So here, in this case in California, there we have a Senate bill that mandates independent physician review, and the CMS final review for Medicaid Advantage plans has a base necessity on individual circumstances, not aggregate AI data. So there are pieces within our larger systems that do indicate that there is a requirement for physician review, or that you're not being used by some AI algorithm that's indicating that you denied that. So asking those questions and demanding the specific criteria for the algorithm is kind of essential. And again, that's safe and fair as we're looking at it. Here, the ambient scribe, again, the threat, clinician uses the AI to record the visit, enter subtle new shortness of breath as discussed, and instead it didn't do that. Instead, it dropped it. So here we look at, we can look at two-party consent and say, well, was two-party consent disclosed? And if they start off with a meeting with, I do not consent to being recorded, well, that's pretty plain and simple that they have revoked consent, which you can do. So pretty good here. Importantly, there's also a generative AI disclosure requirement from the state of California. You can demand that, that review. And at the end of the day, you have an unpenalized right to opt out in certain places. The portal chatbot. So the portal chatbot, in this case, there might be a situation where you see pilots where folks are like, yeah, use this wearable and you can use our portal chatbot to talk with it. And you'll see this kind of happen with decentralized clinical trials and more clinical trials operations, but eventually some clinics will adopt this as well. Should every state follow CA's lead on policy? No, every state needs a different one. Every state has a different scenario, but generally speaking, the ones that California has adopted are pretty good. They're not amazing, I will say that much. They have definitely been neutered to a degree, but they exist and they're working. Texas also has some asterisk mark. Theirs are a little bit more neutered, but they're also different in terms of their orientation. So, for instance, let me see if I can have this one open right now. There we go. So in this case, if I look at, let's see here, state by state. And I've given you guys a record of the different state ones as well in terms of what they have here. In Washington, and Utah, they have coverage denial statements. I know in Texas has some as well. I'm just trying to remember what they are. They're just off the top of my head, not the quickest. But let's see here. But largely speaking, California is on this kind of head here also because we're home to a lot of these companies. So we kind of have a bit of a spearhead in the sense that we've been doing a lot of the pilots generally longer. I know I've been loosely involved with some of the early stuff that was done here back in 2019. So like it's been here for a minute. This is technically not new to us. And so we have been somewhat familiar in that sense. And so there are more experts here who are there. But then again, that being said, how many times have you gone to bat at a, at a congressional place where it's assembly or senate or whatnot, or even for the lower level meetings, and you've gone there and you've seen physicians alongside you. It's very difficult to get them out there because it's difficult to get them to not be doing the work that they love to do and the work that is incredibly expensive and time consuming and difficult to separate from. And even when available on virtual, they are still very restricted in that sense too, just because again, they are very busy people who are often called away for, especially if they are a specialist in this case. And so that can be difficult in that sense. But yeah, I'm hoping that a playbook will come into play at some point within the next year or so for, that has a lot of roots with legal groups. I'm sure we'll see something out of Chilpy at some point on this, just based on their previous work. From my experience with Hep C, in terms of the work that we've been able to do there. And they have done a wondrous work for us there, but it does require a certain synergy of folks that, hopefully we will see more about and more toolkits for. The synthetic clinical trial. Okay, so this part here, this is something that is kind of genuine, that is happening. There are, synthetic control arms. That's the thing that they want to institute. Is that good? Maybe. It does amplify bias hard, really, really, really hard. That can be a problematic situation for, like I said, anybody who basically isn't a white guy. They have to, if you enter a clinical trial, regardless of your race or ethnicity or age or gender or anything of that matter, it's important to ask the question: is there going to be a synthetic control arm? And if there is, was that data, how is that fueled? Asking that question is helpful, although it might get you kicked out of the clinical trial because who knows how they determine that. Hard to know it nowadays because they are getting a bit more iffy, a little bit more choosy on who they pick. So, the right to effective care, efficiency versus effectiveness. Again, here, these are defined for efficiency. So when we see the company touting these things, are they touting these things? The company who's providing the benefit, providing the AI tool, is all their marketing touting these red flags, or is all their marketing talking about a combination of these two things? Because obviously they're going to want to put in there these things because some of these things are going to be useful, like reduces administrative staff time. They're not going to want to put out increases volume of claim denials. I don't think that's a very popular thing to advertise that your product does. But so here's a simple checklist, but this is obviously a privacy data checklist as a whole. What specific data is being collected: audio, genetics, wearables, portable information. And there are some states that do have protection against for genetic data. Some states have this, some don't. I think there is a component in the federal government. I can't recall it specifically. I will have to look it up. I can get back to you guys on that as well. Um, where is the information being stored or processed? Normally, it's going to be on it. It's still going to be HIPAA certified. Like it's for the most part, it's going to be there, but it's good to check. It's good to know these things because you could be dealing with an organization that maybe doesn't know or hasn't checked. Will my audio or sensitive data be used to train future AI models? And how will it be used to train future AI models? It's an important addition on there too, because for the most part, we're talking about the things we're saying. We're not talking about the way that we're saying it. We're not talking about the sentiment analysis that comes into play. We're not talking about the third layer of analysis that comes into play from the larger set of data. When you have a corpus of data on an individual, and you have a series of recordings of hundreds of recordings of that individual, you get a sense of that individual in terms of the sentiment that they come into play, whether they are, they can start to predict other models. There are lots of pieces. Data produces a lot of echoes. And the question is how will that sensitive data be used? There are so many pieces in there. It is very tricky, but asking that question is always helpful. Can I explicitly decline secondary uses and still receive second standard care? So asking that question, saying, hey, I don't want, I want you to be able to use this, but I don't want third-party data to be used. That's a complicated statement. You can state it. They can't do anything about it, but having them know that is still a helpful first step. Obviously, this requires, more work in terms of advocacy towards state houses and other foundations. But asking those questions here lays the seeds, because the thing is, what I've found to be successful, and I think you'll probably have a similar reflection, is that having a lot of clinicians who are articulate in the language of what you're trying to convince, a board about, and having the clinicians and having those groups on your side when you're going to that board and talking to that board and saying, hey, you should do these things, helps a lot. So here's some verbatim scripts. 30-second blanket demand. I understand an automated system may be involved. I am requesting a plain language explanation of what it did and an opportunity to correct errors and access to a qualified human who can reconsider the decision. Bing. One big package right there. If that works, cool. It might not. Someone can always say no. Like I wish it would always be better about that. But the thing is, the more often that person hears it, the more they're going to be aware of the reality that people are challenging this. And right now, that is when you have a pilot and a bunch of people challenge it. I will tell you that's a great way to kill a pilot. Having been having done lots of AI implementations for life science companies, when we did them and even when they had the buy-in of the individuals initially, they would deploy it and they broke it. First thing they would do was just break it as opposed to like try it or use it. And when they did, we had to kill a pilot because we didn't have any data that presented it was useful. And so when these things happen like this, it makes it more difficult for that pilot to be fundamentally imagined or fundamentally utilized in the way that they were, so that they might change it to become more practical, more transparent, or more useful for you. Obviously, reversing an insurance denial is a complicated procedure, but identifying the licensed reviewer and responsible for this denial, just like you would before, explain the specific algorithm criteria used. This is a little bit different, and detail how my individual clinical data was considered over the automated recommendation. This is something that they're not going to be able to do. They're going to have to call you back. They're going to have to do more digging. It's going to require more work. And the question is does the insurance company have an individual who's specifically tasked with that? Totally, they do. The question is do they have the architecture within the call center to be able to attribute that to the right person? I don't know. Maybe they'll have to learn how to do it, because they continue to get complaints in this matter. And if the complaints aren't resolved, well, you also have your, some states have patient advocate generals. Some have the office of the patient advocate. I know here in California we do. You can also talk with your insurance commissioner as well. And so these things can be saying, hey, this is a problem. There are probably also class action suits happening that also might lay in a factor. So again, checklist right here. Could this treat some groups less accurately? For the F, is the tool suitable for my specific needs and demographic? What reliable external testing supports this? Does this improve my care, just save the clinic money? And when a human reviewed it, how do I correct errors? All right. And again, that's my LinkedIn right there. And we do have some asynchronous courses that we'll be launching in Q3 with a colleague of mine who is focused on quality assurance in biopharmaceutical manufacturing. So we've developed it somewhat generally, but it has an office hours feature where it actually goes in to the specific needs of the individuals who are talking there. All right. Any questions or other things? I will stop sharing my screen here.
Anybody has any questions, you can, Karen, let me unmute, you can unmute yourself now and maybe, there we go.
I didn't have a specific one. I was just taking my video off there.
Okay.
I've got lots of questions. I'm just trying to formulate them.
All right.
Yeah, no worries. You always ask me later too, because at the end of the day, like this is something I obviously care a lot about, and obviously personally affects me. As a patient, as a chronically ill patient. Well, I'm a liver transplant recipient and Hep C survivor, so for me, like constantly interacting with multiple healthcare systems is my life. As is anyone else who is a survivor of any condition really at this point, or someone who has a chronic condition right now. Um, you know, so yeah, questions.
Anybody want to, Janet, did you have a question?
I did. A lot of your suggestions imply that we know what the model is, and what the data set is. When it's been my experience that most people don't know what's in the training data set. So how do you challenge a finding when you don't know what went into the finding?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. So when it comes to the model itself, you can request the model card. That is still part of the HTI rule right now. So that is a component that's in there. Now the model card, what does that do for you, right? What does that do for an average person? Okay, cool. I have this information about a tool. Great. Well, what it tells you is it tells you when that data has been trained to. It should tell you a kind of a general sense of like where the training data was attributed from. But it won't tell you much more beyond that. At that point, you have to keep digging deeper, which honestly, as a patient, you don't really have a lot of time for. And so seeing a patient do this without, a serious prompt to find and articulate their specific problem, would be unlikely in that sense, because they wouldn't necessarily want to do that, because it would take probably hours to even figure out who it is. Because I don't think that the hospital group or the provider who is doing it will know. But the weird thing, as I mentioned before, the new rule that is coming under the Trump administration, while it technically puts the onus on the hospital group, that also means the hospital group is going to have to access and have that information. So they will be the owners of that data. They will be the owners of that knowledge. And so in the future, that will be the rule. That looks like one of the ones that's likely to stick. It will also cost them more. So they will be more interested in operating it in a transparent fashion because it will be cheaper, functionally speaking, to do so. But I agree with you. I don't know how them being able to derive the training data will be very easy to do without something like discovery. Reasonably speaking, it's the biggest place where that's going to end up happening is going to be a lawsuit that's going to happen against them, and they're going to find it in discovery. That's my understanding, is that I don't see it really being extracted meaningfully in any other way because they won't be able to extract it. That's my whole problem with it in that sense. But yeah, sorry.
So a few years ago, I was on SACCARB, which was the committee that sets the guidelines for review boards. And we had a big discussion about AI, public discussion, so it's okay for me to say this. But the general consensus was that review boards don't have experts in particular areas. We invite experts in. So if we're ever having to review a clinical trial that's dealing with AI, we'll just call in an expert. It's like, do you know how many experts are actually out there? Uh, there's not enough to support all of the IRBs. And so what do you do when the people who are supposed to be looking at the safety of the patients don't have the information to make the decision, and the decision gets made anyway?
I mean, I think that's the question that we've been facing this whole time in the same sense. This just added AI into the thing. It's the same problem. It's just that now you have this here because there's always a lack of expertise in this space. IRBs have always been, kneecapped by the limitation of both the AMA and other institutions that limit the amount of experts that can be allowed in terms of graduates and stuff. But AI does throw just a whole wrench in that whole system. Uh, 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 shoe in the machine, if you will. And there are fewer experts. I will say this right now, as somebody who does this, right? I've talked to like 10 doctors that I know. And the only reason why I do that is because I'm in a SIG specific for this. A special interest group specifically for this. And that's the only reason why. Outside of that, the only reason why I know them is because I worked with them on a clinical project at UCSD. Outside of these things, there's no way. Because it's just external knowledge that isn't necessarily beneficial to their career. Why would you learn? What would be the benefit? So I can understand that would be a huge limitation. The other thing is that how do you determine who is an expert?
Yeah, what's the criteria?
And the thing is, we have not those things. We're still in a space right now where we're still fundamentally establishing all these things. And so if we are able to produce certain, just kind of like just fence posts, guideposts to say this is where we should move towards. That's kind of what I'm suggesting a lot with this too, is like this is so liquid right now. And like, hopefully if we can have these kinds of demands and have these kinds of requests and have these kinds of pieces, this is where we can move towards. If there is anything I can help in that regard, I will. Obviously I'm here for it.
Are you aware of the organizations in Europe that are trying to come up with universal standards on this?
I'm familiar with some, but more on the pharmaceutical side. So for me, it's tools like MRecon, which is an auditing system that goes through and actually pre-audits pharmaceutical companies before they've even gone in, and actually gives them an error list and says, hey, these are your problems with all your system, and going ahead of time. And I can only imagine that this also staples with healthcare, but I imagine the EU AI Act at least notifies people of this circumstance.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge for patient advocates to step in and do anything about this, even self-advocating, because the clinicians, the clinics, the doctors, even the researchers don't always know what's in there. There was one example when I was working with SACCARB of a study where they had a model that had been working based on a certain subset, which was based on guidelines. The guidelines changed and the data set was no longer consistent. They'd eliminated some of the data that was in it, and the model was still running based on the changed data set.
God.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised, because it sounds like everything I've encountered when kind of working with organizations here in the space. We're like, oh yeah, well, we updated the data set, and I was like, what does that mean?
So did you update the model?
Yeah. And does the model reflect new guidelines, and has it replaced them? Because sometimes what they'll do is they update it and they include the previous, and they don't actually eliminate. It's a lot of training ends up being additive. And so the old stuff is still there, but it's just not as prioritized, because the majority of generative AI systems run on what's called a plurality of truth. And so that truth is generally determined by a plurality of data, as well as what is ground truthed. And so whichever has the bigger gravity is what tends to go towards. So I imagine guidelines will be ground truthed. But if previous ones were ground truthed, then it could make a determination. Gosh, oh my gosh. I don't envy the circumstances for the process here, but I know that somehow we'll all be involved in its
At
correction.
least impacted.
Yes, well, I mean, impacted certainly. And this is I mean, tech's motto is move fast and break things, and it is awkward when that thing is our healthcare system that already wasn't that strong to begin with. But maybe it's an opportunity to build it back better than it was. But I think that is going to require a lot of diligence.
Just a quick question on your email on that last slide. Is that supposed to be solutions or solitons?
I misspelled that, and it's solutions. It should be solutions, prompting solutions that I was typing quickly, and it turns out it did not correct that. No, it's solutions. So I thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep.
And Janet, I'm hoping that by patients learning more of this and learning where the challenges are, people will start speaking up, and that we will have more of a voice as this moves forward. Because as Rick said, this is happening now. And so I'm hoping if we get a bunch of smart patients that want to get involved, that we can make some changes for the better and have some patient rights that go into this from now and not 10 years from now where they realize they screwed it all up. So
One can hope.
one can hope. That's all I have to say.
And we can lean on existing laws too to help us, existing policy to help us, because some of this data attribution and stuff is just really data and data rules and then those pieces. And people make the assumption that training data is separate. I'm like, no, data is data. Laws are laws. This is no different. And the problem is that you have a bunch of people who are arguing that they are different. And they're saying, well, no, this is training data. And I'm like, okay, cool. This is a bison hamburger. That is a kangaroo hamburger. It is still a hamburger.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate
Yeah.
the webinar.
Of course. Thank
All
you.
right. Well, thank you. Again, I will have this up on lungcan.org for folks to review, and all the documentation that Rick has provided with us with all the questions that you can show patients. Those are all up there. All those documents are listed as well, so you can download those and have access to everything. So thanks for attending. Thank you, Rick, very much. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure that this will be talked about and maybe something that that advocates can work on. So thanks. Appreciate it. Have a great day.